5 days ago, a pyroclastic flow raced 4 kilometers down the southwestern flank of Mayon Volcano in the Philippines at temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Celsius. 199,367 people across 124 villages in Albay province have been affected. 5,459 are sleeping in evacuation centers tonight. Parts of Albay have been declared a state of calamity, and PHIVOLCS, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, has the volcano at alert level 3 on a scale that only goes to 5. That's the headline version. Here's the part that isn't making headlines. There is a tropical storm forming in the Western Pacific right now. Its name is Hagupit. It is expected to enter the Philippine Area of Responsibility within the next 48 to 72 hours, where it will be renamed Kaloy. Its projected track brings it along the eastern flank of Luzon, the same island where Mayon sits, as early as Monday or Tuesday of next week. And the reason that matters, the reason I'm making this video tonight, is that Mayon's slopes are currently blanketed in 1 to 3 inches of fresh volcanic ash across dozens of kilometers of terrain. That ash is sitting in 40 drainage gullies that radiate outward from the summit like spokes on a wheel, and every single one of those gullies points downhill toward populated towns. When rain hits fresh volcanic ash, it doesn't wash it away gently. It mobilizes it. It turns it into something called a lahar, which has the physical consistency and destructive force of wet concrete, and it moves at 60 kilometers per hour. The last time a typhoon hit Mayon after an eruption, 1,200 people died in a single night. I'll walk you through exactly what is happening, what the monitoring data shows, what the historical record tells us about what comes next, and why the most dangerous phase of this eruption may have nothing to do with fire. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The Anomaly. Let me rebuild what happened on May 2nd for you. Not as a news story, but as a physical process. Mayon Volcano sits in Albay province at the southeastern tip of the island of Luzon, roughly 330 kilometers southeast of Manila. It is the most active volcano in the Philippines. It has erupted 69 times since its first recorded eruption in 1616. That averages out to roughly once every 6 years, which makes it one of the most frequently active volcanoes on Earth. It is also, famously, one of the most perfectly symmetrical volcanic cones in the world. Postcards, tourism campaigns, wedding photos with the summit in the background. That symmetry is not an accident. It's a product of what Mayon is, a steep-sided composite stratovolcano built from alternating layers of hardened lava, compacted ash, and volcanic debris stacked on top of each other over centuries of eruptions. The steep upper slopes reach a gradient of 75%. The summit crater is roughly 250 meters in diameter, and radiating downward from that crater are approximately 40 gullies, natural drainage channels carved into the slopes by centuries of water, lava, and debris flows. Hold that number. 40 gullies. On May 2nd, PHIVOLCSEs recorded a pyroclastic density current, what most people would call a pyroclastic flow, racing down the Miisi Gully on the southern flank. It traveled 4 kilometers from the summit. The ash column from that event punched 3,000 meters into the sky. That is a significant event. A pyroclastic flow is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, rock fragments, and volcanic ash. It moves fast, often faster than a person can run, and it is hot enough to ignite anything organic on contact. But here is where the first anomaly shows up. The May 2nd pyroclastic flow was not generated by an explosive eruption. It was generated by the collapse of material at the front of an advancing lava flow. Mayon has been in a state of effusive eruption since late January 2026. Lava has been slowly, continuously oozing from the summit crater and flowing down 3 separate gullies simultaneously. The Basud Gully on the eastern flank, where the flow has now reached 3.8 kilometers. The Bonga Gully on the southeastern flank at 3.2 kilometers. And the Mi-Isi Gully on the southern flank at 1.6 kilometers. That is 3 active lava fronts moving down 3 different sides of the same volcano at the same time. And as those lava fronts advance, the leading edges cool, harden, and become unstable. When a chunk of hardened lava at the front of the flow breaks off and collapses under its own weight, it shatters and mixes with trapped gas and the superheated material behind it, and that creates a pyroclastic flow without a traditional explosive eruption. This is called a block and ash flow. It's less dramatic than a Plinian column. It makes for less spectacular footage, and it is no less lethal to anyone standing in the gully when it happens. The anomaly is this. The eruption has been characterized as mid-cycle effusive activity, which sounds controlled and manageable. But the physical outputs don't match that framing. 283 rockfall events recorded in a single 24-hour period as of May 6th. 17 pyroclastic density current signals on the seismic instruments. 11 volcanic earthquakes, 3 of which were tremor episodes lasting between 3 and 6 minutes each. And lava is advancing on 3 fronts simultaneously. That is not what stable mid-cycle activity looks like on paper. And there's something else. On May 4th, an M6 zero earthquake struck eastern Samar, roughly 200 kilometers north of Mayon, at a depth of 73 kilometers. Maximum intensity of V on the modified Mercalli scale was recorded at Borongan. 13 million people felt some level of shaking. 17 aftershocks followed, the strongest a magnitude 3.2. 2 days later, on May 6th, an M5 earthquake hit 25 kilometers northeast of Baganga in Davao Oriental at a depth of only 10 kilometers. Now, I want to be careful here about drawing connections that the seismology doesn't support. These earthquakes are tectonic events along the Philippine Fault Zone and the Philippine Trench Subduction Zone. They are not directly linked to Mayon's magmatic plumbing system, but they do illustrate something important about the tectonic environment that Mayon operates within. This is a region where the Earth's crust is under persistent, measurable stress from multiple directions simultaneously. The same subduction that feeds Mayon's magma chamber is the same tectonic process generating these regional earthquakes. They are symptoms of the same underlying system. And that context matters when you're trying to understand why a supposedly mid-cycle effusive eruption is producing numbers that don't look mid-cycle at all. That brings us to the data. Part 2. The data, stay with me here, because this is where the picture starts to shift. PHIVOLS publishes a daily 24-hour observation bulletin for Mayon. I want to walk through the numbers from the most recent bulletins, because they tell a story that the news coverage isn't telling. Sulfur dioxide flux. This is the measurement of how much sulfur dioxide gas is being emitted from the volcano per day, measured in tons. It's one of the most important indicators of what's happening beneath the surface, because sulfur dioxide comes from magma. The more SO2 coming out, the more fresh magma is degassing near the surface. On May 3rd, The SO2 reading was 1,586 tons per day. On May 5th, it was 1,829 tons per day. That is not a decline. That is an escalation. And to put those numbers in context, during Mayon's relatively quiet periods, SO2 emissions typically run between 200 and 500 tons per day. At 1,829, we are sitting at roughly 4 to 9 times the baseline. Now let me give you the rockfall data. On a quiet day, Mayon might produce a handful of rockfall signals. Minor stuff. Loose rocks dislodged by thermal expansion or wind erosion. During the 24-hour observation period ending May 6th, PHIVOLCS recorded 283 rockfall events. That is not a handful. That is a slope that is actively, continuously shedding material from every face. To put that in perspective, during the April 1421 observation period, PHIVOLCS was recording 267 to 440 daily rockfall events, alongside 0 to 5 pyroclastic density currents per day and 41 to 123 volcanic earthquakes. The April numbers were higher in some categories, but the pattern is what matters, not any single day. What I want you to see is the staircase. Go back through the weekly bulletins from the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program, which compiles PHIVOLCS data into summary reports, and you see a consistent pattern. Each quiet period between surges sits higher than the one before it. The baseline SO2 creeps up. The average daily rockfall count creeps up. The tremor duration extends. Each step is above the one before it. The peaks rise. The valleys rise. The whole envelope shifts upward. This is what volcanologists call a staircase escalation pattern. It doesn't mean an explosive eruption is imminent. It means the system is not finding equilibrium at the current activity level. It's still looking for a higher one. The seismic record confirms this. The seismic record shows 11 volcanic earthquakes in that same period. 3 of those earthquakes were characterized as tremor events lasting between 3 and 6 minutes, which indicates sustained movement of fluid, likely magma and gas, through the volcanic conduit. This is different from a discrete quake, which represents a single fracture. Tremor means continuous flow. It means the plumbing system is active. I want you to think of this with an analogy. Imagine a pressure cooker on a stove. The lid is held down by the weight of solidified material, old lava, compacted ash, the weight of the mountain itself. Below that lid, heat and gas pressure are building. Now, the pressure cooker has a relief valve. That valve is the effusive eruption. Lava oozing out slowly, gas escaping gradually, rock falls relieving surface pressure. The valve is open. Pressure is being released. But here is the question that matters. Is more pressure being released through the valve than is building up underneath? Because if the answer is no, if the magma supply rate exceeds the effusion rate, then the pressure is still rising even as the volcano appears to be releasing it. The valve is hissing, but the pot is still getting fuller. This is the most common misunderstanding in volcanic risk communication. And I want to take a moment on it because it directly affects how you should read every eruption update you see. When news coverage says a volcano is releasing pressure or venting, the implication is that the danger is decreasing. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes effusive activity is a genuine safety valve that prevents a larger explosive eruption. Kilauea in Hawaii often works this way. Lava flows continuously for months or years, and the magma system maintains a relatively steady state. But Mayon is not Kilauea. Mayon is a subduction zone stratovolcano. It produces andesitic magma, which is significantly more viscous and gas-rich than the basaltic magma at Hawaiian volcanoes. Higher viscosity means gas cannot escape as easily. Higher gas content means more explosive potential is trapped in the system. When a stratovolcano is effusing lava slowly, while its SO2 readings are climbing and its tremor episodes are lengthening, that is not necessarily a system finding equilibrium. It can be a system building toward a higher energy state. And the data does not clearly answer that question for Mayon right now. The SO2 flux is climbing. The tremor duration is increasing. The rockfall count is at industrial levels. The lava fronts are advancing on 3 different azimuths. PHIVOLCS has the volcano at alert level 3, which officially means increased tendency towards hazardous eruption. But the contingency plan for alert level 4 is already drafted. An escalation to level 4 would extend the mandatory evacuation zone from 6 kilometers to 8 kilometers and require the relocation of an additional 25,000 people. The mayor of Guinobatan, Anjema Ongjoko, has already said publicly that existing evacuation centers are not enough. I want you to hold that. The system is still escalating. The official framing says mid-cycle. The instruments say something more complicated. And the part of this story that almost nobody is talking about yet has nothing to do with lava, pyroclastic flows, or SO2 readings. It has to do with water. Part 3. The mechanics of a lahar. Let me be precise about something, because this is where most media coverage of volcanic eruptions gets the story fundamentally wrong. When people think about the danger from a volcano, they think about lava, rivers of molten rock, the orange glow, the slow creep. It's visual, it's dramatic, it's what every movie has trained us to picture. And in the case of Mayon, lava is real and present. 3 active lava fronts, as I just described, but lava as a direct threat to human life is comparatively manageable. Lava flows from Mayon are viscous. They move slowly enough that you can walk away from them. In 1984, Mayon erupted and more than 73,000 people were evacuated. The casualty count from that eruption was 0, not because the eruption wasn't significant, because the lava was predictable, it moved in identifiable channels, and people had time to leave. The thing that kills people at Mayon is not the fire that comes out of the mountain. It is the water that comes down it. A lahar is a debris flow composed of volcanic material and water. The word comes from Javanese, and it describes something that has no real equivalent in everyday experience. It is not a mudslide, although it's often reported as one. A mudslide is relatively thin, relatively slow, and composed of soil. A lahar is composed of volcanic ash, pumice, rock fragments, and water, mixed into a slurry that has the density and viscosity of wet concrete. This is not a metaphor. Lahars have been measured at densities of 2,000 kilograms per cubic meter. Water is 1,000. Wet concrete is roughly 2,300. A lahar is closer to concrete than it is to water. And it moves. A lahar triggered by heavy rainfall on a steep volcanic slope can reach speeds of 60 kilometers per hour. Some have been recorded faster. At Mayon, the upper slopes have a gradient of 75%, which is steep enough that the initial mobilization of ash and debris happens almost immediately once the soil saturation threshold is crossed. The material doesn't need to build up gradually. It releases in a pulse. One section of a gully wall collapses. That collapse entrains more material, which entrains more water, which picks up more debris. And within minutes, you have a self-reinforcing flow that gains volume as it descends. They follow the same gullies that lava and pyroclastic flows follow, those 40 drainage channels I mentioned earlier, because those are the paths of least resistance down the mountain. But unlike lava, which typically stays within its channel, lahars can overflow. They can dam rivers, redirect watercourses, bury bridges, and fill entire valleys. When a lahar hits a populated area, it doesn't burn structures, it buries them. It fills the first floor, then the second floor, then the roof is gone, and the structure becomes part of the flow. And here's a detail that most people don't know. A lahar doesn't stop being dangerous when the rain stops. The deposits left behind by a lahar have a property that makes them almost uniquely destructive in the long term. They set like concrete as they dry. The volcanic ash particles are angular, not rounded like river sand, and when they lock together with water and then dehydrate, they form a rigid matrix. Structures buried in lahar deposits cannot be excavated with shovels. They require heavy machinery. After the 2006 event at Barangay Padang, it took weeks to excavate buried trucks and equipment from under meters of hardened volcanic debris. The material had cemented itself around everything it touched. And there is another mechanism that makes Mayon's lahar risk especially persistent. Even without a single new eruption, the material already deposited on the slopes remains dangerous for years. Rain can mobilize it season after season. After Mayon's 2018 eruption, lahars were triggered by monsoon rains well into 2019. After the 1993 eruption, lahar events continued for multiple wet seasons. The mountain builds a reservoir of ammunition with every eruption, and the atmosphere draws from that reservoir every time it rains. The trigger for a lahar is simple: rain. That's it. You don't need an active eruption. You don't need a pyroclastic flow. You just need enough rain falling on a slope that is covered with enough loose volcanic material to mobilize that material and send it downhill. And right now, Mayon's slopes are covered in more loose material than at any point since the 2018 eruption. Fresh ash from the ongoing effusion, rockfall debris from 283 events per day accumulating in those gullies, broken lava from the advancing fronts. The mountain is loading its own drainage system with ammunition. The question is when the trigger gets pulled. And that question is what the next part of this story is about. Part 4, the historical misdirection. I want to walk through the historical record of Mayon because it contains a pattern that changes everything about how you should think about the current situation. February 1st, 1814. Mayon's most destructive eruption, VEI4 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, which places it in the same category as Mount Pinatubo's 1991 eruption, one of the most powerful of the 20th century. Pyroclastic flows raced down all flanks of the volcano. The eruption column punched an estimated 50 kilometers into the stratosphere, according to PHIVOLCS analysis. The ash ejected into the atmosphere contributed to the global accumulation of volcanic aerosols that, combined with the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, led to the year without a summer in 1816. One eruption in Albay, felt in the harvests of New England. The town of Cagsawa, roughly 7 kilometers from the summit, was directly in the path. Hundreds of people sought refuge inside the Cagsawa church, a stone structure built by Franciscan missionaries in 1724, rebuilt on the foundations of an even older church dating to 1587. They believed the stone walls would protect them. This was not an unreasonable belief. Stone churches had survived earthquakes. Stone churches had survived typhoons. But a pyroclastic flow is not wind or shaking. It is a wall of superheated gas and fragmented rock, moving at speeds that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour at temperatures between 200 and 700 degrees Celsius. The pyroclastic flows buried the church. Ash deposits in the Kagsawa area reached 9 meters deep. An estimated 1,200 people died in the eruption, and immediate aftermath. The neighboring town of Budiao was similarly obliterated. Only the bell tower of the Kagsawa church remains above the surface today. It is now one of the most photographed landmarks in the Philippines, framed against Mayon's perfect cone. Tourists pose with it. The rest of the church and the people who sheltered inside it are still underground. Hold that number. 1,200 dead from the eruption itself. But the eruption wasn't the end of the story. It was the setup. The 1814 eruption deposited hundreds of millions of cubic meters of tephra and loose material on Mayon's slopes and in the surrounding valleys. When the rains came, as they always do in the Philippines, that material mobilized. Lahar swept down every drainage channel, extending destruction well beyond the area directly hit by the eruption. The neighboring town of Budiao was obliterated. Additional communities along the river systems were buried. Accounts from the period described the Lahars as continuing for months after the eruption, triggered by each successive rainstorm. Now jump forward. 1897. Mayon erupts again. VEI-4, a violent phase lasting 17 hours. Pyroclastic flows reach the coast at Santo Domingo. 350 people killed. Mayon erupts. Pyroclastic flows down the gullies. 79 people died. Most of them were farmers who had returned to their fields during a quiet phase of the eruption, believing the danger had passed. PHIVOLCS had recommended evacuation. 50,000 people had been moved, but 79 went back. They went back because the eruption appeared to be subsiding, because their crops were in the ground, because their livestock needed tending, and because the human capacity to normalize danger is one of the most powerful forces in nature. They died not because the warning system failed, but because the threat didn't look like the thing they were afraid of. The pyroclastic flow that killed them came without an audible explosion. It was generated by dome collapse, the same mechanism producing flows at Mayon right now, silent at the source, visible only when it was already too late. In 2013, a phreatic explosion, a steam-driven eruption with no warning, killed 5 hikers near the summit. They were inside the danger zone because hiking Mayon is, or was, a popular adventure tourism activity. The explosion came with no precursory seismicity, no elevated SO2. Nothing on the instruments suggested it was coming. These are the numbers that get cited: 1,200, 350, 79. 5. The deaths from eruptions, the fire, the pyroclastic flows, the headline-ready events. But the historical record contains a different number, a number that doesn't get cited nearly as often because it came from a different kind of disaster entirely, and it changes everything about how this situation should be understood. November 30th, 2006. Super Typhoon Reming, known internationally as Typhoon Durian, made landfall in northern Albay province. At its peak, Durian had sustained winds of 195 kilometers per hour and gusts that exceeded 320 kilometers per hour at the Virac weather station on Catanduanes, shattering the previous Philippine record of 275 kilometers per hour set during Typhoon Joan in 1970. The anemometer at Virac broke after recording that gust. By the time Durian reached Albay, Sustained winds were still around 165 kilometers per hour. It was still a devastating storm in its own right. But the wind wasn't what killed people. The typhoon dumped 466 millimeters of rainfall in 10 continuous hours across Albay. In the mountainous terrain around Mayon, orographic lift amplified those totals. Some elevated stations may have received the equivalent of 600 millimeters. For context, that is roughly 2 months' worth of normal rainfall compressed into less than half a day. At that time, Mayon had erupted just months earlier, in August 2006, depositing a fresh layer of ash across the southern and eastern slopes. The gullies were loaded with pyroclastic debris from that eruption, and from previous eruptions that had never been fully cleared. When that rain hit, the lahars formed in minutes, not hours. Minutes. PHIVOLCS and academic studies document that the lahars descended Mayon slopes and reached populated areas within 21 minutes of the onset of heavy rainfall. 21 minutes from raindrop to wet concrete at your front door. I want you to sit with that number because it redefines what warning time means. In most natural disasters, there is a buffer between the trigger and the impact. An earthquake gives you seconds. A tsunami gives you minutes to hours depending on distance. A hurricane gives you days of forecast lead time. A lahar at Mayon gives you 21 minutes. And that assumes you know the rain has started on the upper slopes, which in 2006, most people did not. The lahars that hit during raiming destroyed dikes and containment structures that had been built specifically to manage volcanic debris flows. These were engineered structures built after previous lahar events, designed with a capacity based on historical flow volumes. They were not sufficient. The volume of material that descended during raiming exceeded the design specifications. The dikes failed not because they were poorly built, but because the assumption underlying their capacity, the assumption about how much material was sitting on the slopes, was wrong. The lahar that hit Barangay Padang in Legazpi City buried entire neighborhoods. Heavy equipment was found weeks later under meters of volcanic debris. Houses were not damaged, they were entombed. In Guinobatan, almost the entire barangay of Maipon was buried. In Daraga, barangays Busay and Kulat were devastated. The landscape itself was altered. Rivers changed course. Roads disappeared. Bridges that had stood for decades were scoured from their foundations or buried under debris fields. The topography of the region was physically rewritten overnight. The final death toll from Typhoon Reming across the entire Bicol region reached approximately 1,399 people. In Albay province alone, centered on the Mayon Lahar zone, over 1,200 were dead or missing. 334,567 families, roughly 1.5 million people, were affected across 13 provinces. 82,915 people ended up in evacuation centers. The total damage was estimated at 608 billion Philippine pesos. One survivor, a barangay councilor from Padang named Isidro Santander Jr., lost his wife, his 4 children, and both his parents in a single night. He and his 7-year-old daughter survived. 7 family members did not. At the 18th anniversary memorial in November 2024, Santander stood at the Padang Memorial Shrine and recalled that the lahar swept through his home so quickly that there was no time to react. They didn't expect it. The warning, to the extent there was one, didn't reach them in time. The power was out, the roads were already flooded, and the lahar was already moving. Let me say that again. The 1814 eruption killed 1,200 people, the fire. And 192 years later, the water killed the same number, in the same province, on the same volcano, following the same gullies down the same slopes into the same towns. And here is the pattern I want you to see, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In 1766, Mayon erupted in July. In October, a typhoon hit. Lahar's buried villages and plantations. In 1814, Mayon erupted in February. In 1825, rains triggered lahars in the same deposits, killing 1,500 more in Kaksawa. In 2006, Mayon erupted in August. In November, Typhoon Reming hit. Over 1,200 dead. The sequence is always the same. Eruption deposits material. Rain mobilizes it. People die not from the fire, but from the water. The real danger at Mayon has never been the lava. It's always been the rain that comes after. And that right there is the problem. Part 5. The second timeline. Here is where the two timelines converge. Timeline 1. Mayon's ongoing eruption. Lava flowing down 3 gullies. 283 rockfall events per day, loading those gullies with debris. Fresh ash blanketing the slopes across dozens of kilometers. So, 2 climbing, tremor episodes lengthening. Alert level 3, with preparations for level 4. A volcano that is actively, continuously depositing material on its own slopes and into its own drainage system. Timeline 2. Tropical Storm Hagupit. Hagupit formed on May 6th over the western Pacific, northwest of the island of Chuuk. As of the most recent advisory, it is located approximately 1,895 kilometers east of northeastern Mindanao. Maximum sustained winds of 65 kilometers per hour, gusts to 80. It is a tropical storm, not a typhoon. It is not, at this moment, particularly strong. And none of that matters, because strength is not the variable that matters here. Rainfall is. PAGASA, the Philippine Weather Agency, expects Hagupit to enter the Philippine Area of Responsibility between Saturday evening, May 9th, and Sunday morning, May 10th. At that point, it will be redesignated with a local name, Kaloy. The forecast track has it riding along the eastern flank of the Philippine archipelago, passing approximately 555 kilometers east of Quayuan, eastern Samar, by Monday morning, and roughly 500 kilometers east of Juban, Sorsogon, by Tuesday. Sorsogon is the province immediately adjacent to Albay. Juban is roughly 50 kilometers from Mayon's summit. The current forecast models show Hagupit weakening to a tropical depression by Tuesday as it moves over the Philippine Sea. PAGASA weather specialist Benison Estaraja has stated that the system could move generally northwest and might directly affect the eastern portions of Luzon and the Visayas early next week. The Vietnamese National Center for Hydrometeorological Forecasting puts the probability of Hagupit crossing the Philippines and entering the South China Sea at below 20%, which sounds reassuring at first. But I want to be careful here about what reassuring actually means in this context. Hagupit does not need to make direct landfall to be catastrophic. It does not need to be a typhoon. It does not even need to maintain tropical storm strength. All it needs to do is deliver sustained heavy rainfall over Albay province for 6 to 12 hours. Super Typhoon Reming in 2006 was a Category 5 equivalent at its peak. It devastated Albay with 466 millimeters in 10 hours. But the lahars that killed 1,200 people weren't caused by 265 km/h winds. They were caused by the rain. The mechanism is entirely hydrological. Water plus volcanic ash plus slope angle plus gravity equals Lahar. The wind speed of the tropical cyclone is irrelevant once you have the water. A weakening tropical depression brushing the eastern coast of Luzon can easily drop 200 to 300 millimeters of rain over the Bicol region in a 24-hour period. The terrain does most of the work. Orographic lift, the process by which moist air is forced upward over mountainous terrain, dramatically amplifies rainfall totals on the windward side of a volcano. During remming, some elevated stations recorded totals equivalent to 600 millimeters. The coast saw less. The mountains saw more, because that's what mountains do to moisture. And Mayon is not just any mountain. Mayon is a 2,463-meter stratovolcano with a 75% slope gradient on its upper flanks, situated directly in the moisture stream of any system approaching from the east. It is, in hydrological terms, a natural rainfall amplifier pointed at its own loaded gullies. Here is something else the data shows that I haven't seen reported anywhere. Hagupit formed unusually early. It is the first named tropical storm in the western Pacific Basin this May. The previous earliest May formation in this region was Tropical Storm Hagupit in 2024. The western Pacific typhoon season typically peaks between July and November, with May storms being uncommon. This doesn't make Hagupit inherently more dangerous, but it does mean that the usual expectation, the assumption that the heaviest rainfall risk comes later in the year, that assumption may need to be revised. And the Philippines knows this. The Bicol region where Mayon sits is statistically one of the most typhoon-impacted regions on Earth, receiving an average of 8.4 tropical cyclone passages per year. The eastern exposure of the region means it takes the first hit from any system coming in off the Pacific. This is not a rare event pattern. This is the baseline reality of living in the Bicol region, and it's why the convergence of an active eruption with an approaching tropical cyclone is not a hypothetical scenario for Albay. It is a recurring, structural vulnerability. In fact, it has happened before, in living memory. In October 1766, months after the July eruption of that year, a violent typhoon triggered lahars that carried volcanic debris down the slopes and buried entire villages and plantations. In 1825, the same pattern repeated after the 1814 eruption, killing an estimated 1,500 people in Cagsawa. And in 2006, the cycle completed again with typhoon remming. Eruption, then rain, then Lahar. It is not a coincidence. It is a sequence. And the sequence is reassembling itself right now. The two timelines are now on the same calendar. The eruption is depositing material. The storm is approaching with water. The gullies connect the two. And the window is narrowing. Part 6. The question no one is asking. Let me address something that comes up every time I cover a story like this, because I know it's in the comments already. Is this part of something larger? Is the Pacific Ring of Fire becoming more active? Are we seeing an increase in global volcanic or seismic activity? The honest answer is no. Or more precisely, the honest answer is that there is no statistically significant evidence of a global increase in volcanic eruption frequency. At any given time, roughly 40 to 50 volcanoes are actively erupting somewhere on Earth. Mayon, with its 69 eruptions since 1616, is simply one of the more prolific ones. The Philippines sits on the western margin of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the Philippine sea plate subducts beneath the Eurasian plate, and this tectonic setting produces exactly the kind of volcanic and seismic activity we're seeing. It's not anomalous, it's structural. What is worth paying attention to is not the frequency of eruptions globally, but the specific convergence of hazards locally, and that is what makes this situation different from a routine eruption bulletin. Because the Philippines is not dealing with one hazard, It is dealing with a stack of them. Mayon at alert level 3. Mayon Volcano, 400 kilometers to the south on the island of Negros, also in a continuing eruption state at alert level 2, producing ash emissions as recently as May 5th, with plumes reaching 800 meters. And so too flux, measured at 1,154 tons per day. Mayon's December 2024 eruption forced 87,000 people to evacuate, 46,900 from the town of La Castellana alone. That eruption produced a 3,000-meter ash plume. It is not at Mayon's level of severity, but it is active. It is producing daily volcanic earthquakes and tremor, and it is consuming PHIVOLCS, monitoring resources and national disaster management attention at the same time as Mayon. An M6.0 earthquake struck eastern Samar on May 4th, just north of the Bicol region, with 17 aftershocks recorded. An M5 hit Davao Oriental on May 6. Taal Volcano, 280 kilometers northwest of Mayon near Manila, remains at alert level 1 with low-level unrest, and Tropical Storm Hagupit is approaching from the east. That is 4 active or recently active volcanoes, 2 significant earthquakes, and a tropical cyclone, all within a single archipelago in the same week. That is not a global pattern. That is a local compounding of risks that creates scenarios the individual hazard assessments weren't designed for. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this is a subtle point that has enormous practical implications. PHIVOLCS is volcanic bulletins. PAGASA issues weather bulletins. The Philippine Seismological Network monitors earthquakes. Each agency is staffed by competent scientists doing rigorous work. Each agency's bulletins are accurate within their domain. PHIVOLCS accurately describes the volcanic activity. PAGASA accurately tracks the tropical cyclone. The earthquake monitoring is thorough and timely. The gap is in the space between them. Lahar is not a volcanic event. It is not a weather event. It is not a seismic event. It is all 3 simultaneously, and it requires someone to be watching all the timelines at the same time and doing the math on the overlap. The alert level system for Mayon describes volcanic hazard. It does not incorporate incoming weather. The typhoon warning system describes wind and rain. It does not incorporate the volcanic material sitting on slopes in the storm's path. Each domain has its own risk matrix, and the Lahar scenario sits in the gap between them. This is not a criticism of the agencies. This is a structural observation about how cascading hazards work everywhere in the world. The most dangerous scenarios are almost always the ones that fall between institutional jurisdictions. Stay with me on this, because what I'm about to tell you is the single most important piece of context for understanding the next 72 hours. Governor Salcida of Albay learned this in 2006. He has said publicly many times since then that the lesson of Typhoon Reming was that you cannot treat volcanic hazards and weather hazards as separate problems. They interact, and when they interact, the outcome is not additive, it's multiplicative. A moderate eruption plus a moderate typhoon doesn't equal moderate danger. It can equal catastrophic danger if the timing and geometry are wrong. That brings us to the forecast. Part 7. 2 branching scenarios. I want to lay out 2 possible paths forward, because that is the most honest thing the data allows. Scenario 1. Hagupit tracks north of Luzon, or weakens sufficiently that Albay province receives moderate rainfall, say 50 to 100 millimeters, over 24 hours. In this scenario, minor lahars are possible in some of Mayon's loaded gullies, particularly Miisi and Bonga. PHIVOLCS and local authorities manage the situation with existing evacuation zones and pre-positioned resources. The eruption continues at its current effusive pace. Alert Level 3 holds. The situation remains tense, but contained. This is what the best-case data currently supports. Scenario 2. Hagupit's track shifts west, bringing the moisture envelope directly over the Bicol region. Heavy sustained rainfall exceeding 200 millimeters falls on Mayon slopes over a 12 to 24-hour period. In this scenario, Lahar formation becomes not just possible, but probable across multiple gullies simultaneously. The 2006 precedent showed Lahars reaching populated areas within 21 minutes of heavy rain onset. The areas at highest risk are the same ones devastated 20 years ago: Guinobatan, Camalig, Daraga, and Barangay Padang in Legazpi City. These areas have been partially rebuilt. New concrete dikes have been constructed along some drainage channels. But the 2006 dikes failed because the volume of material on the slopes exceeded their design capacity. And the same risk exists today. The current deposits are fresh, unconsolidated, and sitting in gullies that drain directly toward population centers. There is also a third possibility that I think deserves attention, even though it's less dramatic than the first two. Even if Hagupit dissipates or tracks far enough east to spare Albay from direct rainfall, the southwest monsoon that the storm will drag behind it could deliver days of moderate rainfall over the Bicol region. Not enough for a catastrophic Lahar event, but enough for secondary Lahars in the most heavily loaded gullies. Enough to force evacuations. Enough to damage crops and infrastructure in communities that are already under strain. The 5,459 people currently in evacuation centers are not in a position to absorb even a minor secondary event. The 6-kilometer permanent danger zone accounts for pyroclastic flows and lava. It does not account for lahars, which can travel 15 kilometers or more from the summit along river channels. The towns at risk are outside the current evacuation zone because the current zone is drawn for volcanic hazards, not hydrological ones. In 2006, Barangay Padang was 13 kilometers from the summit. It was devastated. Guinobatan's barangay of Maipon was similarly outside any formal volcanic danger zone. It was buried. I want you to hold that distinction because it is the single most important thing to understand about this situation. The evacuation zone is for the volcano. The Lahar will not respect it. Which scenario does the data favor? As of tonight, the forecast models are split. The European model keeps Hagupit further east, which favors scenario 1. Some ensemble members bring heavy rain bands over eastern Luzon, which opens scenario 2. The 48 to 72-hour forecast window is the critical decision period for Pagasa and local authorities. And that uncertainty is itself the danger, because the decision to escalate from Alert Level 3 to Alert Level 4 and expand the evacuation zone is not a technical decision. It is a logistical one. Moving 25,000 additional people requires buses, routes, receiving facilities, food, water, sanitation, and time. It cannot be done in 21 minutes. It cannot be done in 6 hours. It requires at least 24 to 48 hours of lead time to execute safely, and the weather forecast window that would trigger it is not much longer than that. This means the decision to evacuate must be made before the certainty exists to justify it. The authorities have to act on probability, not confirmation. And that is an extraordinarily difficult position, Because if they evacuate 25,000 people and the storm misses, the economic cost is real, the disruption is real, and the public trust spent on a false alarm is difficult to rebuild. But if they wait for certainty, and the storm delivers 200 millimeters of rain over 12 hours, the Lahars will have already started before the buses are loaded. This is the operational version of the same problem I've been describing throughout this video. The gap between what we know and when we need to act is too small for comfort. And the historical record says that every time the gap was too small and the action was too late, the gullies wrote the consequences. I want to be clear about where my analysis ends and uncertainty begins. Part 8, the uncomfortable conclusion. Let me pull this together. Mayon Volcano is in an active effusive eruption that has been running since January 2026. Lava is flowing down 3 gullies. 283 rockfall events per day are loading those gullies with debris. Pyroclastic flows are being generated by lava front collapse. SO2 emissions are climbing. 199,367 people have been affected. 5,459 are in evacuation centers. Parts of Albay are under a declared state of calamity. And a tropical storm is approaching from the east, with enough moisture to trigger the same Lahar mechanism that killed over 1,200 people in 2006. The official alert level is 3 out of 5. The official framing is mid-cycle effusive activity. The official danger zone is 6 kilometers from the summit. But the historical record says that the deadliest events at Mayon don't happen during the eruption. They happen after it. They happen when the rain comes. And the rain is coming. The mayor of Guinobatan has already said the evacuation centers aren't enough. The contingency plan for Alert Level 4 would move an additional 25,000 people. That plan has not been activated. The decision window for whether it should be is measured in days, not weeks. I want to be clear that I am not saying a catastrophe is inevitable. That would be irresponsible, and this channel doesn't do false precision. What I am saying is that the conditions for a repeat of 2006 are assembling in real time, and the margin for error is shrinking with every forecast update. The 1814 eruption killed 1,200 people with fire. The 2006 typhoon killed 1,200 people with water. In both cases, the ash was already on the ground. In both cases, the gullies were loaded. In both cases, the people who died were in areas that were thought to be far enough away from the volcano to be safe. In 1814, they sought shelter in a stone church 7 kilometers from the summit. The Lahar buried it. Only the bell tower remains above the surface today. In 2006, families in Barangay Padang, in Legazpi City, 13 kilometers from the summit, were buried in their homes. The Lahar did not care about the distance. It cared about the drainage channel, and the drainage channel ran through their living rooms. Today, Mayon's slopes hold more loose material than they have at any point since 2018. The drainage channels are loaded. The towns are still there. The evacuation zones are drawn for fire, not water. And Tropical Storm Hagupit is 1,895 kilometers away and closing. The opening question of this video was whether the Philippines is ready for what happens when the rain arrives. I cannot answer that definitively, and anyone who tells you they can is not reading the same data I am. What I can tell you is what has changed since 2006 and what hasn't. What has changed? PHIVOLCS has expanded its monitoring network. Governor Salcida pioneered a preemptive evacuation doctrine and a zero casualty principle that became a model for disaster risk reduction across the Philippines. DSWD has pre-positioned 93,373 food packs in the region. The government response to the current eruption has been faster and more organized than in previous cycles. These improvements are real. They save lives. What hasn't changed? Mayon is still there. The 40 gullies are still there. The towns are still at the base of those gullies. The people who live in those towns largely rebuilt in the same locations, because the volcanic soil that makes Albay dangerous is the same volcanic soil that makes it agriculturally productive. And the Philippines still sits in the Pacific typhoon belt, where tropical cyclones will continue to deliver heavy rainfall over the Bicol region every year for as long as the ocean is warm. The structural vulnerability is permanent. The mitigation is temporary. Every generation in Albay has to get the timing right, every time, or the sequence repeats. What I can tell you is this: every major Lahar disaster at Mayon has followed the same sequence. An eruption deposits material on the slopes. A period of relative calm follows. Everyone focuses on the volcano. The cameras point at the lava. The news cycle covers the pyroclastic flow. Then the attention fades, and then the rain comes, and the water writes the death toll that the fire merely prepared. The eruption is the headline. The Lahar is the story. And the most dangerous moment in any disaster is when the cameras stop pointing at the mountain and everyone assumes the worst has passed. Because at Mayon, the worst has never been the fire. It has been the quiet weeks after, when the ash sits on the slopes like a loaded spring, and the clouds build on the eastern horizon, and the drainage channels wait. That is when the rain comes. If you made it this far, you now understand something that most of the coverage out there is missing entirely. You understand the sequence: eruption, ash, rain, Lahar. You understand that the evacuation zone is drawn for fire, not water. You understand that 21 minutes is the entire warning window. And you understand that Tropical Storm Hagupit is approaching the same island where that sequence is already loaded and waiting. I will be covering this situation every night as it develops. If Hagupit shifts west, if PHIVOLCS escalates to alert level 4, if the rain arrives before the evacuations expand, you will hear about it here first. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one. I'll see you tomorrow night.